what's next for private renting. My name is Alexandra Jezeph. I'm on the board of Bright Blue, which is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. It has 7 major research themes on the subjects of bountiful economy, clean environment, good lives, rewarding work, empowering government, just institutions, and connected communities. A quick reminder to our in-person audience that this is being recorded and live streamed on the Conservative Party platform, and of course a warm welcome to our online watchers. In hosting this event, we're very pleased to be partnering with Generation Rent and the Renters Reform Coalition. If you're on Twitter, please do tweet the event. We're using hashtag #BrightBlue, hashtag CPC21 for the event, and the Twitter handles are at @WeAreBrightBlue and at GenRentUK and at Renters Reform. There are 13 million people in the UK living in the private rental sector, and a number of households living in the private rented accommodation has doubled over the past 20 years. The COVID-19 pandemic has meant many of us have spent a lot of time staying at home in the last 18 months, and in the case of renters, this has shone a spotlight on the already existing issues of security, affordability, and accommodation standards within the sector. But change is afoot. The Rental Reform Bill is anticipated this autumn and is widely expected to abolish Section 21 eviction powers for landlords and agents, whilst strengthening the position of the Section 8 eviction process. It will also, amongst other things, introduce lifetime deposits with the aim of speeding up and reducing the costs associated of moving between rental properties. Is this enough? Should we be looking at better enforcement of existing housing standards and regulations? And where does all of this leave landlords? In 2021, where does the right balance of power sit between the landlord and the tenant? This evening's debate will examine the state of the rental market and where changes is most needed. And we've asked our panellists to consider a number of questions, including to what extent is the growth of private renting contributing to widening intergenerational inequality? Do tenants have sufficient resources and information to raise and address problems in their homes? What should replace Section 21? How can the government effectively prevent and tackle illegal evictions? And is there a case for a national registry for landlords? So we're delighted to have 4 panellists joining us to debate these questions. We have Councillor David Renard, who is Board Chair of Swindon Borough Council. We have Victoria Spratt, who is Housing Correspondent for the newspaper. Anthony Breach is Senior Analyst for the Centre of Cities. And we have Caitlin Wilkinson, who is Policy Manager for Generation Rent and founding member of the Renters Reform Coalition. So we've got an hour and a half to cover a very hot topic, and I'll invite Councillor Renard to open the discussion.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this important debate, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm delighted to be here today to speak on this vital subject about the future of the private rented sector, and thank you to Bright Blue for hosting today's discussion. As Alexandra said, I'm Councillor David Renard. I'm the leader of Swindon Council, but also I'm the chairman of the Local Government Association Board covering environment, economy, housing and transport. So I'm wearing the LGA hat this evening. So many of our priorities, from the LGA's Build Back Local agenda to our recent guide for councils on improving the quality of the private rented sector, touch upon this really important issue. After the event, please do have a look at that particular document. So the private rented sector is both growing and diversifying. The sector's grown to 4.4 million households and represents around 19% of all households in England, with more children and families taking up accommodation of this kind. Some segments of the private rented sector work effectively and provide high quality accommodation for those who choose to rent or are unable to buy. However, there are also many instances of poor housing conditions which simply isn't acceptable. To illustrate the most recent English housing survey, it showed that the PRS has the highest proportion of non-decent homes, that's 23%, compared with the social sector, which has 12%, and the owner-occupier sector, which has 16%. So much so that the recent report from UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence covering the impact of COVID-19 found that less than half of their survey respondents considered their property suitable for their needs. This was based on factors including affordability, local access to services, and access and upkeep of their property. A report from the Nationwide Foundation also concluded that because of a number of different factors, the supply of properties to the lower end of the private sector, rented sector will reduce in the short to medium term. Some of the factors include the impact of welfare reforms, such as poor yields, legislative changes, and a significant number of landlords reaching retirement age who are then looking to sell. This is concerning, given the increasing reliance on PRS to house people and the lack of alternatives. A thriving, high-quality private rented sector can help bring about a balanced mix of affordable housing in communities. Councils can help to maintain that balance, but need to be given adequate resources and powers to ensure that their residents are fully protected. So what needs to happen to make sure that the future of PRS serves both the interests of landlords and tenants? Firstly, we need to look at housing affordability. According to the Office of National Statistics, UK rental prices have increased by 10.9% since January 2015, and more than 2 million families in the private rented sector face challenges in paying their rent, as outlined by the Jezeph Foundation. To help address the unaffordability of housing, the government needs to give councils the powers, funding and flexibilities to deliver a genuine renaissance in council house building. This includes reforming right to buy so that councils can build more genuinely affordable homes. Councils need to be able to keep 100% of the receipts from the sale of homes, as well as the ability to set discounts locally. But the need to empower councils to build affordable accommodation goes beyond the provision of a safe and secure home. LGA research shows that building 100,000 new social homes per year would result in a £14.5 billion boost to our economy. This would kickstart our construction sector with 89,000 jobs and help achieve the government's 300,000 homes target. In terms of strengthening accountability and tenants' rights, while building more homes and combating affordability is key, it's also important to ensure that the standard of properties in the PRS sector meet sufficient standards. That's why the LGA has welcomed the government's commitment to extend further rights to tenants, both through abolishing Section 21 of the Housing Act to protect tenants from no-fault evictions, and the introduction of a renters' reform bill. So now we need to see that commitment put into action. But we also need to make sure that councils have sufficient powers, funding and flexibilities to enable them to enforce the standards in the private rented sector. Particularly, we would like to see the removal of government approval for selective licensing schemes that cover more than 20% of an area, and the ability for councils to levy more substantial fines for the worst landlords. And these need to be set at a level that will act as an effective deterrent. So to conclude, to secure the future of private rented sector and ensure the supply of the right mix of tenures to meet the needs of local communities, we need to see a multi-pronged approach. This needs to address the unaffordability of housing, empower councils to increase the affordable housing stock, and increase the standards of the property in the PRS sector themselves. The LGA is already taking action to support these solutions, such as by helping secure some right-to-buy reforms that have given councils increased flexibilities to build more homes, and supporting local government through good practice guidance. But it's critical that a national and local partnership is secured which can deliver for future needs. Let's build back local and work towards levelling up our communities. So once again, thank you for inviting me today, and I look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you very much, David. So you've covered a range of subjects there, which I think we'll come back to in the questions, but you've touched on supply standards, the role of the councils, the affordability issue, the impact of welfare reforms, and you've given us a few thoughts on your multi-pronged approach as well. So Victoria, over to you.
Well, I'm a journalist. My job is to ask questions. So I'm interested in knowing how many people in the room are landlords? How many renters have we got in the room? Okay, we've got a pretty even spread. I just wanted to know. I want to explain how serious this is, right? So I'm the housing correspondent at the iPaper. Day in, day out, I'm reporting on the stories of people who are really at the sharp end of this crisis, and it's a mess. Across the country, there are 17.5 million people without a safe, secure, or stable home. That's 1 in 3 adults. Maybe you're one of them. If you're not, maybe someone you love is. If they're not, in the future, they likely will be. 1/3 of millennials will be renting from cradle to grave. This is not just about young people who spend too much money on avocados at brunch. This is about people getting older and not having stable homes, right? That's why this is so important. That's why we have to talk about regulation. The crisis in private renting is a huge part of our housing emergency. It's different in every part of the country, but broadly, the solutions are the same. The way out is for us to regulate the private rented sector, to deal with unfair evictions and poor conditions and unaffordable rents. The number of retired renters has doubled. The number of children living in the private rented sector is rising. These people are not choosing to live in rented housing. They don't have a choice. Why? In the last decade, house prices have outpaced earnings, which has forced people into renting. Rents have also gone up. In many places across this country, the local housing allowance, which is how housing benefit is calculated through universal credit, does not cover rents. Today, the average renter spends almost 40% of their wages on rent. So it's no surprise that 6 out of 10 have no savings at all. And many are just one paycheck away, according to Cllr, from not being able to pay their rent. We also live in a country where there is not a single place, according to the Women's Budget Group, that is affordable for the average woman on her own to buy or rent a home. Just sit with that for a minute. You wonder why we don't have gender parity in this country. Home is where everything begins, and for as long as it is unaffordable and unstable, everything else will remain unequal too. Renting should be fair and stable, but it's not. Why? When Thatcher was elected, there were more people in social housing than there were renting from landlords, and those who did were protected by rent regulation. We sold off lots of our social housing through Right to Buy. We did not replace it. We now have lots of people living in the PRS, and they're not as protected as they once were. That's because in 1980, Thatcher's government, in 1988, brought in the Housing Act, which deregulated the PRS and brought in Section 21 evictions, which allow landlords to throw out renters without ever having to give them a reason from their home. Section 21 is now a leading cause of homelessness. I hear about it day in, day out. Revenge evictions aren't supposed to happen, but they do. Illegal evictions aren't supposed to happen, but they do. Renters fear complaining about poor conditions in case they are evicted. Over 700,000 renters were served Section 21 evictions during the pandemic. 253,000 people in England are homeless and living in temporary accommodation. 120,000 of them are children. Many of them will have been evicted from the PRS. So renters need more rights. This instability is making people sick. It is making our country unequal. In Germany, the majority of people rent their home. Renting itself is not the problem. The fact that it's so unstable and expensive in this country is.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Covering the regulation, the lack of sort of fair and stable facilities for renters, homelessness as a result of evictions, and the need for greater renters' rights. So, Anthony, can I ask you to go next?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you, Alex, and to Bright Blue for hosting this event, and good evening to everyone here in the room and also watching online as well. So I work at Centre for Cities. If you've not heard of us, we're a research organisation that studies Britain's cities and in particular their urban economies, and I'm the lead on housing and planning at Centre for Cities. Our analysis of the housing crisis is that it is primarily kind of a supply problem, that we have a housing shortage in this country, primarily in the most expensive and the most prosperous parts of the UK, mostly in the greater southeast of the country, but also including places like York and Edinburgh as well. This evening, I'm going to talk a bit about kind of the geography of renting and how that relates to intergenerational and geographic inequality up and down the country. So, if you look at sort of renting as a kind of private renting as a share of kind of the population across the country, there's not an obvious geography at first, because the social housing actually complicates the picture in that certain areas have far more social housing due to kind of political and historical reasons within their boundaries. But if you look at private renting as a share of all private housing stock, so including homes which are owned outright or with a mortgage by people, there's a clear geography actually to renting across the country, with the most prosperous and the most expensive places having far more private renting than places which are less prosperous. Another way of phrasing that is that home ownership is more common in places where it is cheaper, which is makes maybe perhaps common sense, but that's the general pattern we see across the country. Now, a consequence of the housing shortage and ever kind of increasing costs on households, ever increasing housing costs facing households, is this geography of the housing crisis actually creates two distinct inequalities across the country. The first is an inequality within expensive cities and prosperous cities, so that as my rent is going up due to the shortage of housing, my homeowning neighbour is seeing their housing wealth rise as their house prices rise. So there's an inequality and divides within cities that are caused by this underlying crisis. But there's also a second inequality looking at the differences in housing wealth between different cities across the country. So we can see, for instance, that if you imagine two twins, one who owns a house in Brighton and one who owns a house up in Sunderland, from 2013 to 2018, the twin in Brighton will have seen their house price and their wealth go up by £89,000. Within Sunderland, it's probably about £3,000 to £4,000. So we can see actually here that the housing crisis has a knock-on effect, not just for renters, where people like me are having their consumption suppressed, but also it relates to the levelling up agenda and increases in wealth inequality across the UK generally. Now, as Vicky and David both said, kind of the nature of renting has really changed over the past kind of 30 or 40 years. With it's no longer the case that people are temporarily in private rented accommodation when they go to uni or when they move to a new city for the first time. We're seeing far more families stay in the private rented sector for long periods of time, and there's perhaps kind of a case for stronger protections for tenants and rights for tenants on that basis to reflect the fact that the nature of the market has changed. But I think if we're alongside kind of any measures to increase the rights of tenants and to reduce costs that they face, the underlying issue is really a housing shortage, and we need to be thinking about how do we increase the production of homes and the construction of homes, especially within the most expensive places in the UK, which have the most inequality on both of these metrics, which I've set out, and that in turn means a discussion about planning reform and changes to the institutional design of our planning system, so we can increase supply.
Lovely. Okay, thank you very much, Anthony. There you touched upon the supply problem, the geography of renting, the intergenerational issues that flow from that, some of the inequalities looking particularly between and within cities, and the need for stronger protections for renters. Caitlin, over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Caitlin. I'm from Generation Rent, the national campaign group for private tenants, and I'm also representing the Renters Reform Coalition, which is made up of 20 housing organisations. I'm going to start by thinking about some of the comments that the new Secretary of State for Levelling Up made yesterday on the conference floor, where he said that two crucial pillars of levelling up were pride in place and living standards. And, to my mind, you really cannot achieve either of those two things without addressing the housing crisis and without fixing private renting, which in its current form traps too many people in insecure homes, unsafe homes that are unaffordable and that they could be asked to leave at any point. And I think broadly the panellists have covered some of the key issues with the private rented sector, that it's doubled in size, that it's no longer just people in their 20s and 30s on the path to home ownership. It's actually families. Private renters are getting older, broadly living in unsuitable accommodation. 1 in 8 privately rented homes is actually not just unsafe, but of such poor quality that it constitutes a serious hazard to health. And Section 21, as we've highlighted, means that landlords are able to evict tenants without giving a reason. And Generation Rent actually ran some research that estimated around 700,000 of those happened, and that was with the pandemic on. And so, every year, hundreds of thousands of people are asked to leave their homes without being given a reason. And I'm not here to demonise all landlords or make broad brush strokes, but I am here to relay what tenants say to us as a campaign group, which is that Section 21 stops tenants feeling secure in their homes and invested in their communities. It's difficult to put down roots or raise your children or feel a sense of pride or connection to the place you live when you know that tenancies are 6 months to 1 year. And when it comes to the end of a tenancy, a landlord, if they want to sell the house, if they want to let it to someone else at a higher rent, if they don't need a reason at all to ask you to leave. Throughout the pandemic, we spoke to people who were key workers, who were asked to move and couldn't find anywhere else, so had to move miles from their children's schools. The PRS traps young people and families and older people into insecure housing, and it has a significant effect on living standards. And one of the key issues for us around Section 21 is the issue of revenge eviction. So Section 21 makes it much harder for tenants to raise issues with substandard qualities or repairs in their homes. So a revenge eviction is what is known as when a tenant raises a problem or somehow has a disagreement with the landlord and is evicted as a result. During the pandemic, we heard from one renter who was of retirement age, who'd lived in her home for 15 years, had a very good landlord. That landlord then decided to sell the property to someone who didn't want to make repairs. And when she complained to the council, she was served an eviction notice. And I mean, we are aware that the cases we highlight are some of the worst in the sector, and that there's a huge amount of landlords out there, including, I'm sure, many of the people in this room who wouldn't dream of acting in that way. But the reason I've decided to highlight them is because the current system and the power imbalance in the system makes it too easy for a small minority of rogue and criminal landlords to get away with it, and it needs to change. And it is hopefully changing. I mean, 2 years ago, the government pledged to end Section 21. Quite a lot has happened since then, but we're pleased to see it still being spoken about at conference. It's still in the manifesto, and we're hoping that these reforms will have some of the biggest impact that the sector has seen, in this generation, which is why that I'm not here just representing Generation Rent today. I'm representing 20 organisations who formed the Renters Reform Coalition, right down from, I can see some of them in the room, from Jezeph Foundation, Shelter in Crisis, down to grassroots organisations and tenants unions. And we are, united in our desire to see a fairer housing system in the Renters Reform Bill. We want Section 21 is abolished. I think it's really important that the right system replaces it. And for us, that means indefinite tenancies, which are flexible and allow a tenant, provided they have done nothing wrong and not broken any terms of the contract, allows them to stay in the property for as little or as long as they like. And this would mean that both tenants and landlords would feel invested in the home as a long-term place to live, and builds greater trust, means that tenants are more likely to treat it as their home and want to kind of report anything wrong with it and take care of it. We have 10 policy principles, which I'm not going to go through with you now because it is 6 p.m. on the final day of conference. But one of the other things that we're really, really keen to see in the legislation, and that we welcome the government's commitment to looking into, is a national register of landlords. I'm pleased to hear that it's come up in other fringe events as well. At present, there's no record of who's a landlord, and there's no lots of councils aren't even aware of the number of private rented properties in their local authority, and it's actually it's very difficult to enforce against something if you don't even know who's in operation. And there's also no one checking that on a regular basis, that these properties are meeting minimum standards. I mean, if you have a car, every few years you have to go and take it for an MOT to make sure that it's not dangerous. And I mean, it seems ridiculous that a home, something that has, as Vicky pointed out, can impact all of your life. There isn't a register that checks that. So that's something that we would like to see, a register requiring evidence that landlords are meeting minimum standards as a condition of registration with registration removed from people who fail to do that. Yeah, and I think, you know, there's lots of work that needs to be done to make sure that this is adequately resourced and effective. But yeah, I just want to end on a sort of more broad point, is that I think, you know, it's for a stable and safe home is the foundation to create a successful and happy life. And I mean, there's no way that we can build back better from COVID if a fifth of the population are living in homes that are insecure, and that lots of people in that fifth of the population are living in homes that are not meeting minimum standards or that are endangering their health. And, you know, we've got to build more houses, as Ant said, and we've got to invest in social housing, as David said. But there will always be, you know, in every area of the country there are private renters, and we need to make sure that private rented housing is fit for everyone who lives in it. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. You've touched on pride of place, living standards, the sort of the need for the National Register of Landlords. We need to build more. I think that's a lot of consensus on that. Indefinite tenancies, I'd quite like to come back into that, into the Q&A session, because I think that will perhaps make a lot of landlords rather nervous. But, right, we are now going to throw it open to the floor if there are any questions. Can I ask you to wait for the mic and do try and speak straight into it so we can hear you? It's also for the benefit of the people online. So, two gentlemen at the front here.
Hi, Andrew White from the home builder Berkeley Homes. One thing that no one sort of mentioned in the discussion so far is the sort of increasing professionalisation of the rental market. So previously, the British rental market was sort of an outlier in that everyone was a sort of accidental landlord or an amateur, which meant that you had this huge variability in quality. Do you think that as well as a regulatory move to do with Section 21 and things, the tax changes that the government has put in to advantage professional landlords could be taken further just to drive up quality from the other end rather than just a regulatory point of view?
Okay, thank you very much. And the second speaker behind, I think.
Hello, Shane Morgan for Derbyshire Dales. I'm actually a tenant, and I also act as the landlord for my parents' portfolio. And one thing I've noticed from the panel today is we all seem very acting like the landlords are the enemy, and they're all anti-Section 21. But from my perspective, I've had one property where the tenant under the COVID Act went in, paid 1 month's rent, and fell back on the legislation. I couldn't issue the Section 21 for 6 months. So do you not think the panel needs to be, as well as protection for the renters, in when we have awful landlords that the property's falling apart and it's all dire, when I make sure all our properties are a certain standard, that there needs to be more protection for landlord. We sat there for 7 months, 6 months with no rental income. Thankfully it wasn't mortgaged, but if that was mortgaged, the bank would be on our tails saying, well, we need the money.
Okay.
Thank
you very much. David, did you want to fill those
Yeah,
first?
I'd love to comment on both of those, thanks. I think in terms of the question about the professionalisation of PRS, yeah, I'm certainly hearing that there are some large institutional investors who are really interested in this sector and are looking to invest for the long term, for a long-term income stream. So I think we will see a lot more of that, and I would be hopeful that if these large investors with who are household names, they have a reputation to protect, and I would hope that the quality of those homes that they bring forward are good to start with and then maintained. So and also tying into the point that you made about the individual, or should we say small-time landlord, they are being discouraged from entering the market or even staying in the market. So we are seeing them leave for a number of reasons that some of us referred to earlier on. So I think that you may see an increase in the quality because of that, because these institutional investors won't have an interest in getting out in the short term because they're there for a long-term income stream. So I think that will probably make a really big difference. In terms of getting a balance between the landlords and the renter, I mean that's the challenge, isn't it? To make sure that it's fair on both sides. I think the example you gave was pretty specific to COVID, because the government obviously brought in those the regulations that they did in order to protect people of not being evicted during COVID, with the potential health problems for them and other people that would have resulted from that. Yes, I would agree that it can't all be one-sided, and that the landlord has to have some rights as well. But coming back to the point that Caitlin was making, these are people's homes, and sometimes they're in them for many years. And if we are going to do what Michael Gove was saying in terms of making communities, then I think it's probably, some people, different people are going to have different needs, aren't they? Some people are going to want a short-term rent. You know, some people are renting near to me at the moment because 6 months suits them, because they're going to move on somewhere else afterwards. But equally, some people who want to put down roots, bring their families up, put their children through school, don't want to have to move after a short period of time. So, you know, it's not an easy one to resolve, but I think, yeah, there needs to be a balance in the system.
Victoria, did you want to comment on that?
On the first question, I mean, are you talking about build to rent, or are you talking about corporations buying up homes that would be in the market for other people to buy? Because I think that's a really important distinction.
I think it's probably a bit of both, actually, because we deal with sort of build to rent explicitly, but actually a lot of new build property is also financed by those amateur investors buying one flat off plan rather than 200 flats off plan. And I'm sort of interested how the market might change on that basis. But also, there's in the constituency that I live in, there's someone who, as a private individual, has bought up sort of 80 different houses and split them into flats and got HMOs on them all individually. And he's essentially turned a residential street into student accommodation without planning permission. Yeah. Those are two different types of market change, and you know, it'd be interesting to see if we can encourage one and discourage the other. I think
encourage build to rent, discourage HMOs. Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, on build to rent specifically, I think it will fill a gap in the market, but I think that standards have to be high, and obviously those landlords need to be subject to the regulations that all landlords are. In the student housing sector, something I've reported on a fair bit is those corporations not always treating students brilliantly, and we really saw that in the pandemic. So I think that would be important. But on people buying up homes that would be in the market for first-time buyers, I think that would be worrying. So two slightly different things. And on the second question, so is the issue that the tenants stop paying their rent? Sorry, classic journalist, got to get the facts straight.
So it's all right. So I won't, obviously, confidential information, but the individual was a teacher. So we knew there was a salary coming in. There had to be. But they just simply said they're under financial hardship and they just stopped paying the rent. Now, we had the choice to go CCJ, which personally I did, and then now subsequently got bankrupt. But it's the combination of both, because when the COVID Act came in, and we all understood why, they had to keep them in to secure homes, etc. But coming off what the gentleman was saying here, if they want to live long-term rent, there's hundreds, like Aviva, Legal and General, especially in Manchester here, there's properties that are literally designed alternative to buying, long-term rent. Go into that market. If you want to live 6 months, from my perspective, then go for 6 months or 12 months. Personally, I think we should keep the Section 21.
Well, I think, obviously, your situation, I'm so sorry that you went through that. It sounds very difficult and very specific to COVID, because under normal circumstances, you would have been able to Section 21. I think that we still need to get rid of Section 21, because I hear from people all the time who are evicted. They're not behind on their rent. Their landlord just doesn't like them. I recently interviewed a lesbian couple who were Section 21 because their landlord was homophobic. Interviewed a young black woman in Bristol who was evicted by her landlord. I think it was probably racism. You know, these things happen. So I think getting rid of Section 21 is still really important, but perhaps strengthening Section 8 can make sure there are still ways to get rid of tenants who stop paying rent, for instance.
Thank you. Anthony, Caitlin, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think on the build-to-rent sort of institutional investor question in particular, it's to declare an interest here. I live in a build-to-rent property. and it's good. My experience is definitely coloured by living in a build-to-rent from 2017 to 19, and that was good. Then spending years of the pandemic in a flat which was rented by a buy-to-let landlord, and my electricity off half of my flat was cut off for a month because the wiring, the fuse box was, I think the electrician described it as prehistoric and hadn't been replaced. And now I'm back in a build to rent again, and definitely noticed kind of the increase in quality in kind of the housing services I'm getting from that big landlord. And I think it's strange because, as the gentleman was saying, like this is a big change in the kind of housing market in the UK. It's basically an entirely new product, which is increasing its supply and kind of availability, across the UK every single year. Interestingly, the kind of original kind of heartland of build to rent was often in city centres and kind of flats, especially kind of in London in particular. But what we're seeing now is actually kind of an expansion of that institutional landlords and investment outside of the big cities, and actually often into the suburbs as well. So a lot of kind of new build estates which are provided on the outskirts of cities. It's not unheard of, at least now, for a big institutional investor to come in and snap up, a big chunk of those properties, and then let them out to families and to people who are looking to move into that area. On the kind of tax changes question, I don't know enough about sort of like the tax treatment of institutional investors versus kind of buy-to-let landlords. I do know that the government has been, obviously has been very encouraging of the creation of the build-to-rent sector and this kind of professionalisation of the sector as a means to sort of address some kind of housing quality issues in the market. I think there's also like a corollary to that, which is if you look at those other countries which have more kind of institutional landlordism, they also tend to have longer tenancies and kind of greater tenant rights. And they go sort of hand in hand in that if you are kind of committing to like a higher quality rental service, and a lot of these kind of big landlords, they have a preference for kind of unfurnished properties, which are quite uncommon in the rest of the UK housing market. If you have longer tenancies and it becomes easier to convince tenants that actually it is worth spending, hundreds of pounds kind of buying a sofa, buying kind of a TV and a media unit, etc., to take with you to know if you then move on to a new unfurnished property that will also be of high quality. So I think there's kind of an element here in which actually the professionalisation of the sector and also kind of increasing certain kind of tenants' rights and building confidence among tenants that renting in the UK can be high quality and can be affordable actually go hand in hand. But it'd be interesting to hear maybe from some of the audience about how those tensions can be worked out.
Thanks, Anthony. And I can also add on the BTL front, from an operational perspective, the scale of these schemes are such that the price points of some of the running of them there are economies of scale, which in the longer run means that hopefully those prices will come down in that respect.
Yep.
Which at the moment it's a higher end product at the moment, but there's diversification coming down the track as well. Caitlin, did you want to comment on any of those points, or happy to go to the next round?
Sure, just briefly, on the issue of a tenant refusing to pay rent, I think it's worth reiterating that that's not something that we're seeking to make it more difficult to remove a tenant who's broken the terms of their agreement. And outside of COVID, and I think now all the restrictions are ended, there is already what's known as a mandatory ground to evict tenants who haven't paid rent, which means that if you can prove that the tenant is in arrears, then the court has no choice but to evict them. It's not discretionary. It's pretty clear in the existing legislation that non-payment of rent leads to eviction. I think our issue is that with Section 21, because you don't have to give a reason, you could be giving a reason for a perfectly valid reason. You could be giving notice for a perfectly valid reason, such as your tenant's not paying rent, your tenant's doing something antisocial, you need the house, you need to, or you could be doing it for a reason that Vicky highlighted. I think our issue is that there is nothing in the legislation at the moment that distinguishes from those two different situations. And once Section 21 is gone, of course we'll have to look at, and the government is looking at new grounds to make sure landlords need who need their property back can get it. So I just thought it was important to highlight that distinction. But yeah, let's move on.
Okay, thank you very much. Next round of questions. I can see 3, 4, so we'll go for the gentleman in the aisle here and the lady to follow.
Full disclosure, I've actually rented my house off a Labour MP for 8 years, but she's just put a new carpet in, so I can't complain. But I just want to go back to Caitlin's point about the inspection against minimum standards. I think sometimes what lets good policy down is the lack of bite and enforcement at the end. So just interested to hear about how that would be enforced, and also what happens to tenants who are found to be in unsafe accommodation, and how will they be protected if major work needs to be done on the house, for example? Is it the local authority who needs to step in, or is it the landlord themselves?
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take it to the ladies in the row behind, I think, had her hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, excuse me. I agree with a lot of what has been said about the housing register and those kinds of things. But as a landlord myself, I do really struggle with the removal of the Section 21. And as much as I sort of appreciate the sort of concerns with regards to, sort of the eviction because someone has complained about repairs, but we have moved towards protecting that. If there is a counterclaim for, someone putting in repairs, that can be challenged in court, so that if we've got those rules in place, then we need to use that to enforce it rather than taking away Section 21 for the good landlords that just need to use it. And there are times when it does need to be used because the other routes just don't work. And I think this is sort of using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, because unfortunately there are some bad landlords out there, but we shouldn't all be penalised because of them.
Okay, thank you. And I'll refer to one of the questions that's come in online because it's basically the same. Joshua has mentioned it's a matter of fact that some tenants are bad tenants and fail to pay and damage the place. How do you propose good landlords can kick out genuinely bad tenants? So, again, David, do you want to kick us off with those?
Okay. Thanks, Alexandra. So in terms of minimum standards and how are tenants protected from unsafe situations, well, there's an issue around the right for the landlord to enter the premises, isn't there? And there have to be some good reasons to do that, and some tenants don't necessarily let landlords in to deal with unsafe situations. So there needs to be the opportunity for landlords to be able to intervene in the case of unsafe properties. And the question was asked, well, should that be the local authority? Well, of course, the local authority, if they've got their own housing stock, would deal with that anyway. So I don't think as an LGA we're calling for those additional powers, but there does need to be a way of making sure that people are living in safe accommodation. In terms of retaining or not retaining Section 21, I mean, as I said at the beginning, I'm speaking on behalf of the Local Government Association, which of course is a coalition of all the political parties in local government, and the policy of the LGA is that Section 21 should be removed, which the government have given a commitment to. And I understand there are arguments both ways, but of course, we've got good landlords and bad landlords. And of course the rules have to apply equally to everybody, and that's the challenge.
Okay, thank you. Victoria, you referred earlier to the stories that you're hearing directly on the Section 21. What's your feeling on that from the flip side of it as well?
Well, I think we have a problem because we don't have enough social housing, and private landlords who are individuals are effectively providing a service, providing a public service, and it's an essential service, right? Housing is really complex, it's really important. There are lots of things attached to it. You have to make sure the property is safe, you have to make sure the tenants are not going to suffer a gas leak or whatever. It's a really, really important job, and I think lots of individuals have taken this on, and it's complex. They're not social workers, they're not building safety experts. If we had more social housing, perhaps it would be less of a problem. But all that being said, we are where we are. And I think Section 21 is misused. There are lots of good landlords who wouldn't dream of misusing it, but there are, and I see this all the time, and I think everyone's referred to it, so many who do. So we have to think of housing as an essential service, and like, I don't know, think about the food you buy in the supermarket. If you went to a supermarket and they were like, oh, we can't really be bothered with health and safety regulations, you wouldn't buy food from them. But if that's your landlord, you can't just leave. So I think we need to get rid of Section 21 and find other ways to make sure landlords can get properties back when they need to, but protect tenants, because homes are fundamental. It's where everything in your life begins, and too many of them are unsafe. And I hear from tenants all the time who fear complaining in case they are evicted. And I suppose that speaks to the other issue that's coming up here, which is enforcement. You know, the Homes Act, the Fitness for Habitation Act, was initially voted down by the Conservatives, but then they voted for it after Grenfell, which was Karen Buck's bill, was supposed to make this all a lot better and make sure there were minimum standards so that homes were fit for human habitation. But enforcement's a big problem. Lots of local authorities don't have the resources. I hear from tenants all the time who keep calling and not getting answers, and then even when they do, local authorities don't follow up and don't have the resources to. That's a huge problem. There's no point in us having the legislation if it's not joined up. So I think we need to see all of these things as part of the bigger picture.
Anthony, would you agree with that?
Yes, definitely. I think I'd agree both with Vicky and with David that if you're serious about enforcement, then you need to be serious about building capacity in local government and ensuring local authorities have the resources to pursue responsibly, lead on the areas in which they're responsible for locally. And there's an element of how much of that should be grant funded, how much of that should be through fiscal devolution and through local government funding and finance reform. But I see it as very difficult as to how you can solve the enforcement question without any sort of recognition of the role of local government in that process. I think there's also kind of like a broader question here, looking to the lady who was asking about the end of Section 21, which is sort of, I think, one area in which we, in terms of addressing kind of the bad landlords who do exist, and in addressing improving the rights of tenants and improving the experience of tenants, part of the solution has to come from not just imposing more obligations upon landlords, but also in improving the condition of the housing market as a whole. And if our argument kind of at Centre for Cities in terms of thinking about sort of this quality question and in terms of the provision of housing services is that you need to fix the quantity problem to fix the quality problem. And if we had a much more responsive and elastic housing market in which many more houses were being built every year, if we actually had more empty houses in the UK, so that tenants had more kind of opportunities and options to choose from and to pick from, this would transfer power from landlords over to tenants. But it would also mean that rather than having a system of kind of insecurity for landlords, which may be the case if very strict obligations are imposed, that actually it's the market itself which is allowing kind of tenants to choose between good landlords and bad landlords. If they sign a letting agreement or enter into start renting from a bad landlord, they know that they can just leave and go to a good landlord who offers something nearby for a competitive price and for much better quality. So I think there's like a broader planning reform, increasing supply market area, which we should be thinking about when thinking about how to improve the rights of tenants.
I might just piggyback on that question in terms of the supply and quantity of homes. Are we saying that we need more homes to buy, more homes to rent, or all of the above? But if we are introducing Section 21 clauses, potentially we could see more landlords leaving the market. So what's the ask in that respect? Did any other panel want to comment on that?
Yeah. I'd be happy to comment on that. And the issue with landlords leaving the market is one that we hear often. And I mean, broadly, as long as this was something gradual and managed, and as long as the landlords weren't also bulldozing or leaving the homes empty when they go, it's not something that we see as being a problem. I mean, we've spoken about how the PRS has doubled in the last 20 years. I mean, provided that not everyone leaves the market at exactly the same time, which we think is relatively unlikely, given that every time new legislation comes in, there are lots of threats that landlords will leave the market, and broadly that hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened in Scotland. But even if it did, a landlord is likely going to sell up that property and sell it to another landlord or sell it to a first-time buyer. the houses don't disappear unless the landlords are also building them themselves. So broadly, we think it's unlikely to happen in any dramatic way. And if it did, I think, long term, a smaller private rented sector and more people owning their own homes who want to could only be a good thing.
David,
Yeah, as I said in my opening remarks, I think that there's an imbalance now in the housing market, and there are not enough opportunities for people who want to buy to be able to buy, and there are not enough social houses for those who are on waiting lists across the country. And that's why the LGA is calling for a revolution in building more social housing, and it's about rebalancing the market so that those who want to buy can afford to buy, but also those who want to go into social rent or indeed private rent have the opportunity. And I do agree with Anthony, it's about supply and demand. If there's more supply, then the customer has more choice.
Well, I disagree slightly on this because I think we have to talk about the housing crisis regionally. There is not one housing crisis, right? It's different in every part of the country. And supply, yes, in some places, you're completely right, is a huge part of the problem. But I recently wrote an article about Hull West and Sunderland, two places where there are lots and lots of empty homes. And what's been happening there is really interesting because community groups have been buying them up and renting them out at affordable prices to people within the community. Now, lots of what was already in the PRS was not affordable to people who were in receipt of housing benefit. So it's not always the case that supply is the problem, and I think this is a bit of a fantasy. Everyone seems to think if we just build lots of homes, everything's going to be fine, but I'm not sure that's the case. Of course, we do need to build more homes, and that's part of the problem in the kind of private buyer's market, but we also need to fix the PRS, and ultimately we do need to build social housing because there are lots of people renting who would, years ago, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, have been in social housing. So I think it's got to be treated as a sort of three-pronged approach, but I think we're wrong to say that supply is the solution for the whole country, because there are some places where that's just simply not the case. There is the supply, but it's not fit for purpose, or it's not affordable. Or, to link it back to the levelling up agenda, whatever that means, hopefully we're going to find out in the white paper, there aren't the jobs, so people don't want to be in those areas. And I think, let's not get into rent control, even in a hypothetical way, but where there is demand, rents are high, and that's another problem.
Anthony, do you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think definitely like the nuance in that housing conditions vary across the country and housing markets vary across the country, in line with kind of the performance of local economies. It is entirely correct, and I think when thinking about the levelling up agenda, it's been interesting watching a few Conservative MPs sort of say, primarily from the home counties, around London, say that we need to level up the country. Actually, what should happen is those lucky northerners should take some of our housing targets, and we should actually build far more up in the north of England and far less in my constituency. And I think, as Vicky was saying, I think that really is kind of a misreading of sort of the urban economics of how to make these places more prosperous. And that actually it's kind of a focus on skills, a focus on developing kind of city centre economies in particular, on commercial property often, will be the right approaches in those parts of the country. I would then maybe slightly disagree on kind of the idea that supply is maybe some of your ideas around supply, in that I think broadly more supply generally makes all of these other problems much easier. And sort of if we continue under the existing kind of planning system or kind of existing low rates of building compared to other countries, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to achieve significantly noticeable improvements in affordability and quality for renters.
You and I are allowed to disagree, that's it.
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to go to a couple of the questions that are coming through from online. Ben has said, the panel talked about home ownership solidifying personal wealth. Should rules around mortgages be relaxed? I cannot borrow enough to purchase a property because of my salary, but I could afford interest and repayments if I were allowed. Other countries are more relaxed about this, so that's on the sort of first-time buyer front. And Thomas has said, haven't the Conservatives done enough for tenants already? We've abolished fees, we paused evictions for a long time now, and now we're trying to make it harder to evict tenants by changing Section 21. So a similar point to what we've already heard there. But this point around mortgages, I mean, that is a real challenge for first-time buyers across the piece.
Well, yeah, we're in a mess because house prices have outpaced earnings. Now it's really, really expensive. I own, through Help to Buy, a one-bedroom flat that was $500,000, and I can only afford that flat because of the Help to Buy scheme. That's very worrying. I paid over the odds. It's not worth what I paid for it. It's terrifying. But I've interviewed lots of economists recently and what they've said has really troubled me, which is that if house prices keep rising the way that they are, I mean, we have several options, right? People become increasingly priced out of home ownership, which is what's been happening, which is why the PRS has expanded, as well as the dearth of social housing. Or, as one economist, I think this was Josh Ryan Collins at UCL, author of Why You Can't Afford to Buy a Home, great book, really recommend it. He said, well, we might end up like Japan, where mortgages are passed down through generations because housing's so expensive. We might see 40, 50, 60-year mortgages in this country if things continue as they are. And it is completely true that now there are people on middle incomes who can't afford to buy homes. The government's done some stuff to try and get them onto the ladder in their COVID response, which is these 95% mortgages. And obviously Help to Buy was another effort. But the problem is so much bigger than that, because houses are now, in many parts of the country, really expensive in relation to wages.
Yeah. Okay. David, do you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, the LGA doesn't have a view on this, so I'll give you my personal view. I mean, I do agree with Ben online, and I do sympathise. Admittedly, it's going back a while now, and some people in this room might remember this, but back in the day, it was all related to the ratio between earnings and house prices. And you used to be able to get a mortgage on the basis that it was 3 times the salary of the higher earner plus 1 times the salary of the lower earner. And for most people, that was an opportunity for them to get onto the housing ladder. And of course, back then you also had 100% mortgages, which obviously don't exist anymore. So I do think there's a lot more that the mortgage industry could do, but fundamentally it's the ratio between house prices and wages. So unless wages go up or house prices come down, that's why government needs to come up with the Help to Buy scheme and various other schemes.
Caitlin, do you want to comment on that as well? And also perhaps, given that you're representing Generation Rent as well, do you have views on how this is affecting older generations as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And then if I'm allowed, can I come back on the question about enforcement afterwards? Because I think it was a good one. And what's the point of bringing in new regulations if you can't enforce them? Broadly on the question of mortgages, I'm broadly in agreement with David. I mean, the issue is that house prices are rising much quicker than earnings, and house prices saw record growth in the pandemic. I mean, when something's so obviously detached from what people are able to pay, we know we have a problem. And I think access to credit is important and would help more people get on the housing ladder. I think it would only be a short-term solution, whereas actually, building more and causing prices to come down is the answer. And I think this is something that is going to be a massive issue for the party of home ownership, in that the average age of renters is getting older and older. People in their 30s and 40s now, and we know that people are much more likely to vote Conservative when they own a home. And I think if the trends continue in the way they are going to, we're going to end up with ever more credit. So I think the only answer is to build more to bring prices down and build more affordable homes where they're needed. On Johnny's question about how would anything be enforced, I think it's a good question, and I think I wanted to answer it because the private rented sector is one that, as someone online said, there's been so many changes recently, and there's so much regulation already, and councils actually have really extensive powers over landlords. But what we know is that they don't use them at the minute, and that broadly councils don't enforce against landlords for it's more complicated, but 2 main reasons, lack of funding and lack of insight. And so the reason that, from our perspective, a national landlord register would be such a good policy is because it's a new policy that actually would help you enforce against all the other policies. So if you have a national register of landlords, you work out where they are. You also know hopefully a council will know which houses it owns itself, and will know which ones are owner occupied. The gap that you don't have record of is most likely to be the rogue landlords. And you can also track all sorts of other things like, once you had that system in place, you could build on it to put energy efficiency savings statuses down, to put almost anything. So I agree with you. There's no point just making new policy if you can't enforce it, which is why I think this would be a tool that would be new, but also would help enforcement of old. Sorry to divert.
I'm going to maybe I have some trepidation, I think, about the mortgage relaxation kind of arguments. I've heard very good arguments that that our current regulations are too strict. To steal David Willetts' comments from a panel earlier today, made the observation that mortgage restrictions on buy-to-let landlords are much looser than they are for first-time buyers. And it seems a bit strange that we should have such different treatment in terms of eligibility for mortgages. But I worry that if we loosen, if we decide collectively that our tool to kind of increase housing affordability is yet another kind of demand-side policy to tackle what is fundamentally a supply-side problem, that it will only end up increasing house prices further, and we have exactly the same situation 5 to 10 years down the line, but with house prices even higher and even more unaffordable, and spurring yet more kind of subsidy and financial risk-taking by households and also by the government as well. I thought kind of Vicky's Japan example is kind of an interesting one in that if there's one thing I would like to copy from Japan in terms of their housing policy, it is their planning system. In that currently we build about 244,000 homes a year, and that's probably like a decade-long high pretty much. Japan is building 800,000 homes a year, and their population is falling. So I think if there are things we can learn from other countries, and and the housing is much more affordable in Japan, obviously. If there's things we can learn from other countries in that tackling that supply side response and getting our institutional systems right, I think that would be a big improvement.
Excellent. Okay. Next round of questions. Is there any more in the room? Thank you, gentleman at the front here, and the gentleman. Yeah. Thank you.
Just on the interesting point of Japan, I actually own a house in Japan.
Oh, excellent.
But I think there's a tendency to think that markets are like a one-way street. And one thing we've learnt from Japan, some of you might be too young to remember that at the end of the 1980s, the Emperor's Garden was supposed to be worth more than in Tokyo, was supposed to be more than the whole of the state of California. And they had a massive correction in Japan. I can remember when I was in Japan in the 90s thinking I would never in my lifetime be able to afford a house, which is probably what a lot of people in this country might feel. But that's completely changed. There's actually been no price growth in Japan for about 25 years. I would just say as well, in the point about new builds in Japan. Obviously, Japan's a country of earthquakes, so it's unlikely that the buildings last there very often. But I also think that in thinking about supply side, I've attended a lot of sessions here where we're talking about trying to get to net zero on carbon. And I think we always have to bear in mind as well the embodied carbon and what a massive impact that construction is having. In our hope. Well. Sorry, yes, that's enormously long comments. So yes, I just think that I've been really interested to hear what you've had to say. But I would just say that I think it would have been great to have here today someone from the supply side, and particularly from the private rental sector, because my impression of the private rental sector is that most of the representatives of it really want to be professional and probably would be up for, on their own side, creating a register of professional landlords. Because I think if you are a professional landlord, it's extremely frustrating to see the relatively small number of rogue landlords bring down the sector.
Okay, thank you very much. Some observations there on net zero and the landlord side of things. And there's a gentleman at the back who's been waiting patiently as well.
My name's Jonathan Berg. I'm from Brent Central, but speaking in a personal capacity. I've been a tenant. I am currently a landlord. I am also a homeowner. I would comment that one of the things the very under-resourced housing officers who trained myself and a bunch of other landlords way back in our accreditation scheme said was that councils don't really look and don't really have the resources to look and make the kind of housing judgments that they used to make. And say the regime up to the 60s, there was a first name term relationship between landlords and housing officers. Now, we're all for improvements in standards, and I think that standards work brilliantly for new build. But the question I have is, when we're dealing with this struggle on the brownfield old property stock that we have, do we want to create a situation where people go non-compliant, the tenant can't be asked to leave for 2 months while energy efficiency is brought in, energy efficiency is all done, and then you discover the insulation has made the room too small to legally relet the property, etc., etc. And that is actually a big number. I mean, I'll just float a number. 300,000 Metroland houses have rooms which, if you insulated them by 100 millimetres, would become too small to use as a bedroom. How do we use brownfield stock and restore discretion to the housing system, so standards are not used as an absolute whip, but that when we bring in this regime of inspection and enforcement, that we also restore that discretion to allow a house that's okay to be used?
Okay, thank you very much. So really there's a sort of a net zero and refurbishment angle to both those questions. Any first takers, David?
Okay, two very difficult questions actually. I mean, on the first point about, earlier on it was mentioned LNG and Aviva as private, investors in this sector. For next time, it might be worth inviting one of those along to come and take part.
Indeed, we'll take that away.
In terms of retrofitting and developing brownfield site, I mean, developing brownfield sites is expensive, and therefore lots of developers don't want to do it. I must admit the point you make about putting in insulation and then making them below standard, I wasn't aware of that. That's an interesting point. So thank you for that. I mean, my big concern, certainly the LGA's big concern, is around permitted development rights, and what we're going to see on brownfield land where offices are converted into residential units, which will probably be for private rent, and whether the space standards and the quality is going to be there. So the LGA's position is we don't support permitted development rights, but the government seem to be very intent on continuing with it. And I do think we're building up a problem in the future, both in terms of building communities and in terms of quality of life for people in the private rented sector around PDR. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. Anthony, did you want to come in next and maybe bringing that PDR point in as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think kind of scatter of thoughts in response to both of those questions. So I think one problem with kind of increasing development on brownfield land is we don't have that much brownfield land left. After 25, 30 years of brownfield first policy across England, it's got to the point now where the industrial land in London is now worth more per square metre than residential land. So we do need to be thinking about urban expansion in the most expensive parts of the country, and that's going to require difficult conversations around greenbelt. I think broadly our analysis of the planning system is that discretion in the planning system and housing policy has not worked well when it comes to supply in terms of the discretionary granting of planning permissions, and we support a more kind of rules-based approach to the planning system, as a means to increase supply. This is what we see in other countries, that more discretion basically means less supply and worse housing outcomes. So it'll be interesting to sort of see if there's a difference there between kind of housing enforcement and discretion, and then also kind of the basic supply and demand elements of the market. I mean, on minimum space standards, I think one of our more controversial positions is that we think that minimum space standards should be at the very least reduced, if not abolished. In that if you look at, for example, minimum space standards are basically far too large, and they make housing far more unaffordable for low-income people. As an example, the lowest minimum space standard for a one-bed flat in London under the London Plan is 37 square metres. But the average amount of floor space each renter has within London is 25 square metres. So the average new build the smallest flat that can be built within London, legally, that's not under like sui generis or some other framework, is 50% bigger than the average amount of space the average renter living on their own has, which means one beds are too large for one bed for people to live on their own, and they're forced to share houses as a result. It's why one bed kind of studio living is so uncommon within London, is the houses are too big. So we think they should at the very least be reduced to 25 square meters, or ideally abolished. Your comments about Japan, which is very interesting. I don't want to turn this into a Japanese housing panel discussion. Maybe if Bright Blue invite me back next year, we can have one. I'd love to do that. Yep. But it was interesting, in Japan, they did a planning reform after the bubble burst in the mid-1990s, which I believe is part of the reason why, there's the whole thing around, the Plaza Accord in the 1980s, which is why you have that big bubble. But they actually did a big planning reform, which has then kind of increased supply in the most expensive places as a result. But on the embodied carbon point, one thing that's very carbon friendly about their systems, because they have so much demolition, which does release kind of carbon into the atmosphere from construction, is places near public transport are much denser, and public transport is much more accessible to people who live in Tokyo than it is within London. So, and other UK cities, and we've got some research coming out on this pretty soon.
Okay, thank you. Vicky, did you want to comment on the questions, but also this one bed's too big point as well, I think?
Oh, well, let's start with that. The 300,000 figure is really interesting. I'd like to know more about that, but I suppose I would put it in the context of us talking about 300,000 homes versus millions in the PRS that need to be brought up to scratch generally. And PDR really, really, really troubles me, and I'll just bring it back to the stories that I tell and the homes I go into. And I have been in converted office blocks where there are mums with kids with no space and tiny, tiny rooms, and they're too hot because they're office blocks. They're not meant to be homes. They are not fit for purpose. PDR. I've, as you can imagine, as a housing correspondent, been into lots of really horrible buildings that people are living in, and nothing has troubled me more than PDR or upset me more than having to leave those people in those buildings. And I think the idea that any solution to the problem we face with housing is converting office blocks into homes is just completely barking up the wrong tree. I mean, there's one in Croydon. I'm from Croydon. There's actually a bar that I used to go to when I was a teenager called the Black Sheep Bar. And above it were offices. They've now been converted into flats, and they are just far, 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 far too small. They're actually not for the PRS. They are being sold through Help to Buy, which maybe the government's not quite aware of, but they will be soon when those flats don't meet fire safety standards and can't be sold. So I think PDR is really, really, really troubling. But I think it's important to put your 300,000 figure. I mean, that's a huge problem for people who own those properties, right? But I think we have to put that figure in context. So that's what I would say on that. And you alluded to the crash in Japan. I think that's really interesting. I hear a lot of people, mostly on the left, saying that a crash is the solution to our problems. I'm not sure that is either, and that's all I have to really say about that.
Can I make 2 quick points on PD? So
we disagree on PD too, and we've disagreed several times.
Yeah, we have. I think what I would say about PD is I think the examples you give are kind of a really good example of why kind of demolition is really important. And we arguably don't demolish enough housing in the UK. We demolish about 9,000 homes a year compared to 244,000 new homes every year. Like if these structures were demolished under the new kind of ZA permitted development, that's now possible. They could be replaced with new purpose-built residential, and that would be much better. But I think kind of alongside that, the fact that PD has increased supply so much, I think it gives kind of an indication of why planning reform is important, in that removing kind of discretionary granting of planning permissions, like the rationing of land for development, did increase supply, arguably in a very problematic way. But if we did that in a way which is more structured, that had more focus on standards, we could get a big increase in supply generally.
Okay. Thank you. Caitlin, did you want to comment on any of what we just heard?
I'm going to just bring it back to net zero. And it's a really interesting point, actually, and something that I'm going to look more at. And I think anything that encourages landlords to improve the energy efficiency of existing housing stock is definitely welcome. I mean, it's a shame that the Green Homes Grant was such fizzled out in such a way. But I think from what it sounds like, I mean, I think that might be one broadly. I'm actually very in support of minimum space standards, but this does seem like one area where where 2 contrasting bits of legislation are just incompatible. So thank you for raising it. On PDR, I'm going to let you two argue about that one. I don't think we need like more arguing over planning broadly in this conference, but yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? I think there was a gentleman at the back there. Do we have a second?
Can you catch that?
Thanks. Richard Cllr, leader, Wiltshire Council. Two points. There's been a lot of discussion about complexity and solutions. There's been no mention of shared ownership yet. And when I talk to private renters, and they are a very hard group to consistently talk to, but when you get down to the details of what they could afford and what their aspirations are, shared ownership often seems to be the solution on paper, but never the solution in practice. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about why that is. Coming back to the point around enforcement, and I'm probably using your own research, Vicky, there was something that you put in, and it was in a UK 100 report, and it was referencing the eye, that 17 out of 268 authorities had taken enforcement action, and only 17 had, I may be getting the numbers wrong, only 17 had done it, had actually gone ahead and taken action. And also, when it came to EPCs, apparently apparently the private rental sector, probably in 2016 earlier, it was something like 38% had actually carried out the EPC they were required to. Yet as a council, I'm afraid my resource is entirely focused on adult social care and children's services. Well, it's not. I'm doing a lot of housing. That's separate. But I've got no resource to put in. How on earth are we meant to, even with a register, how are we going to do anything about it? Because without that understanding of where the problem is, how can we address it? And the house is burning down in adult social care. I'm afraid the house decaying in the corner isn't the priority when one's burning down.
Okay. Do we have a second question, or we'll carry on with that one? David, do you want to come?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, interested to hear that Victoria's from Croydon, because I'm originally from Croydon as well, but I don't think the Black Sheep pub was there when I was there.
For you.
I'm sure it was very good. I used to go to one called The Cartoon, which isn't there anymore. Anyway, in terms of picking up on Richard's points, I mean, obviously, we're council leaders of adjoining local authorities, and we face similar problems and challenges. So around enforcement, yeah, absolutely. The bulk of our budget is going on adult and children's social care, and all the other services that we're expected to provide and our residents want to see have to come out of the money that's left. So from a local authority perspective, we really do need this solution government's proposal, hinting that they will come up with to social care funding issue. On shared ownership, yeah, I'm not necessarily convinced, Richard, that is the answer. From what I hear, there is sort of shared ownership, and some of it works quite well and some of it doesn't. I think the issue is around the staircasing. So if you buy in 50%, that's fine, but, and then you pay the rent on the rest. But actually, it's not always easy to staircase up to the next 10% and next 10% until you get the whole thing. And it does seem that some of the landlords of the other half of the property don't necessarily want people to staircase up into full ownership, which is obviously what we would want to see. So, yeah, I think that does need a review. Good deep dive on the policy issue. I obviously, like you, I'm supportive of anything that will get somebody into their own the home ownership of having their own home. But if you go in on the basis that you can staircase to full ownership, there's got to be a way that you can do that.
Thank you. Vicky, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about shared ownership if we're here sitting on a panel about renters, because it's part by part rent, so you are still a tenant. And you're sitting at the intersection of several different aspects of the housing crisis, which is, if you're unlucky enough to be in a shared ownership building, I've reported on lots that are affected by the building safety crisis, you're dealing with that. You're a leaseholder, so you're dealing with that. And you have also paid quite a lot of money for a house you only own a bit of, maybe will never own all of. And I think this speaks to the problem we've got with house prices. And I'm quoting an economist I've interviewed before who said it's just a creative way of getting more people into debt to prop up the housing market. His views, not mine. Although I think I probably agree, and I'm not sure that it's a panacea. I think it's full of problems. And I hear from shared ownership tenants/owners all the time who are really being caught in the weeds of being a leaseholder and snookered by the cladding crisis. And I think we need to be careful with these affordability schemes. And I think Help to Buy, which I'm implicated in, is also really problematic. Be very interested to see what's going to happen with that in the next few years. I interviewed the Spratt who was behind it, and he asked me if I'd paid off my Help to Buy loan yet. That's over £250,000. Don't know where he thinks I'm getting that money from ever. So I think shared ownership, Help to Buy affordability schemes need work, and not really sure what we do about them.
Yeah, I think in particular, kind of like local authority resource, it's such a problem, and that local authorities don't have the resources to do anything more than just be social care providers, right? Like local government has an incredibly important role to play in delivering, great outcomes to people, not just in social care and housing, but across all manner of things. And we can see over the past kind of 10 years that their ability to deliver for their residents has just has diminished. And I was struck even that when we were discussing kind of a national insurance kind of increase over the past kind of couple of weeks, we weren't really even still talking about kind of the underlying problems of local government funding and finance. And really, if we want to kind of tackle enforcement and increase enforcement, we've got to fix the problems in that.
Thank you. And Caitlin, did you want to comment on that at all, or I can go to the next questions?
Yeah, I just echo everything that's been said before on local authority funding, and just want to clarify that, don't intend to bash local authorities on their PRS enforcement record. You'll have far too much to do, and it's a very disparate sector. And there's been the decline of tenancy relations officers, and I don't underestimate the scale of the problem there. So yeah, but unfortunately, local authority funding is not something I can control.
No. I have a different question, which I might direct to yourself and Vicky in particular. But if we take sort of the example of spare room and the issue of AST, so as I understand it, there isn't a standard form of AST at the moment. Do you think that is something that would be advantageous to introduce? And if I go back to the mention of spare room, where the person renting the flat isn't necessarily the owner and therefore doesn't have the legal right to grant a lease. So there's something around the AST piece and who can grant leases and that informal side of the market. And the second thing that I was going to sort of draw out of that is, isn't the very nature of the formality of spare room and that sort of solution ones that cut out the lawyers and cut out the agents part of the appeal for the landlord and the tenant in some locations? And therefore, do you think we could see new unregulated solutions popping up in response to that type of demand? So whilst we're trying to make it more regulated and more sort of a system and everyone knows where they stand, is there a response that could try and counter that in some ways?
So we're talking about where flats are more informally rented out, sublet, where you might live with your landlord who's your mate, or you find someone through spare room, you don't go through a letting agent. Those, I guess they're all related but slightly separate. I mean, I can see the appeal. I used spare room when I was a renter, and cutting out letting agents' pre-letting fee ban was really, really great. I mean, less expensive to go through a letting agent now than it was then. But I think if you are subletting informally, I come across these stories all the time, you can get into a real pickle with rogue landlords, and then you're not properly protected. So I'm not sure, based on what I've seen, would want to see more of that. I recently did a story about a woman who was subletting from another tenant, and the landlord wasn't paying tax and was reported to HMRC, and then just pretended he didn't even know she existed. And then the DWP came after her and asked her to repay all her housing benefit. I mean, it was just a quagmire of issues. And I think deprofessionalising the PRS any further could potentially create more of those problems.
I think my question was more, do you think there's a risk that will informally happen anyway? Do we tighten regulations and then something else pops up instead?
So I think there's two parts of that. The first one is that if when you remove Section 21, you remove you by de facto would remove a fixed term tenancy. So the reason we like indefinite tenancies is that they are more flexible instead of being. So I know indefinite just sounds like it would go on forever, but what it means is that the tenant would be able to leave when they chose, or the landlord would be able to evict when the tenant violated on one of the grounds. So actually, you might get more tenancies that are sort of a month, a year and a half, or 18, it's month by month, so it's more flexible than the existing system. The second question on, if you make it harder to let out properties through tightening regulations, does a shadow sector emerge? That's something that is a very valid concern, and something that I think in some places in Scotland is where they have abolished Section 21 is a problem, and we can learn from it. I am going to bang the drum for a national register again, because if you have a national register, you can also include short lets, Airbnb, spare room, and I think one of the main problems. I mean, in London, for example, you are only allowed to do an Airbnb for 90 days. So, I mean, if you regulated it in that way, it wouldn't mean that lots of long-term homes would suddenly go into short-term lets. But yeah, when you are changing tenancy reform in tenancy law in such a significant way, oversight and data of the private rented sector is essential. Otherwise, that reduces the risk. So
Okay,
all comes back.
I'm going to land a different question, perhaps towards Anthony and David, and that's back to this EPC rating requirement. So by 2025, there's an expectation that all new rented properties will be rated C or above, and existing tenancies have until 2028 to comply. What do you think that will do to the rental market in the next 5 to 6 years? Is that overall a good thing? But given where we are and where we've got to, is it realistic that we're going to hit that?
This is not a question I've considered before. I think that's ambitious. I would not be surprised if we unfortunately did not meet those targets, but I don't have any more insight than that, unfortunately.
No, that's fine. David, did you comment on that?
I was in an event with a developer earlier on, and I don't know if they build for the private rented sector, but they made it very clear that anything that they built by 2025 was going to be EPC rated A. So there are some developers out there who want to build to a very high quality. Clearly, the government and all local authorities have got targets around net carbon zero, and I think, developers are going to have to step up to the plate. Now, in terms of whether that is going to, these buildings are more costly to build, so I imagine that some of those costs will find their way through to people who are buying and also people who are renting. But yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure we've got the answer to it yet.
No, that's fair enough. I'm going to round off because we've only got a minute or so left with the typical question of, if there was one element of this that you think needs to change or is the upper priority for yourself, what would that be? Vicky, did you want to have a moment to think about
$1 million question.
Yeah.
I suppose what I would say, and I'm not sure that you can do any one of the reforms we're discussing without doing all of them. I think they're all, part of the same puzzle. Ending Section 21, a national landlords register, improving standards. I think it all has to happen together. But what I would say, I suppose my priority would be everyone needs to be a bit more optimistic about reform. Because the last time we sat on a panel together was the letting fee ban, which I was advocating for. And everyone said the sky was going to fall down and letting agents would all go out of business and it'd be terrible. And we're still here, and that law has gone through. So I think we shouldn't be so scared of reform. It's important to talk about it and hear everyone's concerns. But ultimately, we're in a mess, so something's going to have to give.
Yeah, but a positive outlook on it in the same time. Anthony?
Yeah, I would say broadly the kind of planning reforms which are currently under discussion in kind of the planning bill, kind of an ambitious one which brings us closer to international best practice and can help reconnect local supply to local demand would be my, if I had a magic wand, that's what I go for.
Thank you. David?
Not surprisingly, as DLJ, we're pushing for the 100,000 social homes to be built every year through local authorities, but maybe some from housing associations as well. As I said in my intro, it's going to generate the green jobs, and it's also going to put the additional supply into the market that certainly Anthony and I are agreed on that is required, admittedly not across the whole country, but that will, I think, help all sectors and all tenures.
Excellent. And Caitlin?
I don't think anyone's going to be surprised to hear that that I think it's ending Section 21 and extending the basic right of a secure home to England's 11 million private renters. I'm sure that surprised no one. But
yeah, excellent. on that note, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our Renewing the Lease panel and indeed our programme for Conference 2021. It's been a very engaging discussion and a thought-provoking conclusion to our event series. So if you would like to know more about Bright Blue or become a member, do sign up with the team at the back. We are offering membership for £10 during party conference, so that's pretty much now or never. And if you missed any of our Bright Blue events over conference, they are available online via the Bright Blue YouTube channel.
Okay.
So with that, I will say a big thanks to our expert panel for joining us today, to our supporters, Generation Rent and Renters Reform Coalition, and to our guests for your contributions and questions as well. Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.